Hey guys, Action Jackson here, with Legends of Runeterra returning to its second early access phase this coming week. I figured it was time to dust off my microphone and start making some videos again. I haven't really done any since Artifact kind of unofficially died. Hopefully it comes back at some point. I'm excited for the prospect of that, but in any case, we do have a game that does embody at least some of the things that I really loved about Artifact in Legends of Runeterra, and I was having a ton of fun playing it during that first beta phase. So with it coming back pretty soon, I wanted to go through one of the decks in this video, and then I'm going to have another video on another deck coming out pretty soon that I really found to be very strong towards the end of the beta phase last time. I didn't really have enough time to refine it the way that I would have liked, given the fact that I only discovered it like the evening that it sort of went offline for me. But regardless of that, I do think it's a really strong deck, even if it does need a little bit of tuning, and I'm excited to show it to you guys. So, without further ado, let's talk about Zombie Bird Control. Okay, so as many of you guys probably are aware if you've been following Legends of Runeterra at all throughout its first early access phase, some of the most popular decks played at the moment, or I guess the two most popular that at least I saw streamers playing and being discussed on Reddit and that kind of thing, would have to be the Shen Fiora Barrier deck, and then also the War Mother Control deck, which is a very, very popular list. A lot of people found it to be very difficult to beat in the beta. Now, of the sort of three decks that I made myself that I feel like are very good, none of them have particularly struggled with either of those two decks. And I actually think, especially with the Shen Fiora Barrier deck, that it isn't a good deck. So, I'm going to go through a couple of the examples of decks that I found which seemed to dominate, this first one being Zombie Bird Control. So, let's take a look at the deck list and talk about the premise of the deck a little bit. So the premise of the deck is essentially that Anivia, if you could get multiple copies of her, is extremely strong because of her attack trigger. Like, if you can swing in with 3 leveled up Anivias, you are dealing 6 damage to the board and their face at the same time. That is not something that, hardly any creatures can deal with. Hardly any decks can generate a board that can deal with that. It doesn't particularly matter that the Anivias can be blocked while the trigger's on the stack or the chain or whatever they call it in Legends of Runeterra, because you're just going to whittle them down with those triggers anyway. Now, how might you go about generating lots of copies of Anivia? Well, in some colors, like in Ionia, there's some cards that can generate copies, but the thing that I think is really interesting about Anivia is that if you kill her, then she's going to actually turn into that egg, and that egg is going to come back as a full copy of the card, rather than with some decks where if you are making copies, they're just going to go away at the end of the turn, right? That's one of the really strong things about Anivia's Last Breath. As a result of that, her becoming ephemeral, for example, is actually only to your benefit. And in addition to that, if she dies and is resurrected by something, that also means that you're going to get an egg, which is going to turn into Anivia next turn, and you get the Anivia, the resurrected Anivia, this turn. So, very, very interesting premise, I thought, and there are some cards that really allow for you to explore this kind of direction. The two most critical ones in this deck are Splinter Soul, which makes a copy of an ally, not a follower, which is one of the key things about this card, which is ephemeral and 1/1. We don't care that it's a 1/1, because we're mostly just trying to generate lots of copies of the full thing, and that ephemeral 1/1 is going to come back as an evolved Anivia next turn. And also Mist's Call, which means, if we sacrifice an Anivia with something like Absorb Soul or a Glimpse Beyond, or if we used Chronicler of Ruin, we can then get Anivia back with Mist's Call. So in the case of Chronicler of Ruin, you're actually getting 2 that turn and 1 the next turn, which is utterly insane, because this one actually reads kill an ally and then revive it. So you generate 1 egg, revive the Anivia, and then if you use Mist's Call, the only thing that's died that turn is Anivia, so you get another Anivia. Very, very strong stuff. Now, there is kind of a nut straw for this deck, which I wouldn't say is the way the deck normally plays, but you can imagine how insane it would be if you get this card combination. But basically, if you are on the play and you start off with like 2 Oblivious Islanders, which gives an ally in your hand ephemeral but reduces its cost by 1, as well as 1 Anivia, then draw another Oblivious Islander and Splinter Soul on the way to turn 5. You can basically play Oblivious Islander every turn on Anivia for the first 3 turns, reducing its cost to 3. And then on the end of turn 4, assuming you haven't played anything else, you will be able to play Anivia with your 4 normal mana, and then a Splinter Soul using the spell mana that you've saved up, meaning that at the end of turn 4, you have 2 ephemeral unevolved Anivias, or unleveled up, I guess. Then when you pass back to your turn, remember, I said you're on the play, so you're on odd turns, you're attacking. You will resurrect the 2 eggs from the ephemeral Anivias that died. They'll both be leveled up, and you can, before the opponent can do anything on that turn 5, you can start combat, so they can't play any slow spells, swinging in with 2 5/4s that both deal 2 damage to the entire board. So in that instance, you are effectively swinging in for 14. Now, probably only 4 of that is going to hit. However, it's very unlikely that the opponent is going to have a board after that. And on sort of upcoming turns, you're just going to be swinging in for haymakers every single time. Not to mention, you can start generating even more Anivias with things like your Chronicler of Ruin and that kind of stuff. So, like, that is the absolute nuts. Obviously, that hand is not something you should really mulligan for all of the time, because depending on the colors you're playing against, you want to consider whether you need to play a more controlling game or not. But even still, like, someone actually rushing you down by that turn is, in many cases, just not something that many decks can do. So, as mentioned, that's kind of the dream hand in certain matchups, but this deck at its heart is more of a combo control deck. You can see that we have a lot of spells that are removal spells. You've got your Avalanche, you've got your Grasp of the Undying, Withering Wail, all that kind of stuff, which is very, very good for dealing with many of the decks that are popular in the metagame right now, and that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. This deck is just disgusting against Shen Fiora control, because if they're trying to go for the Fiora win condition, you can get rid of your creatures before Fiora gets credit for the kill using your sacrifice effects. And on top of that, Barrier is not good against Anivia's trigger, because when she swings in, if they use a barrier spell, it goes on the stack, and then your trigger happens before combat, so you're going to pop their barrier with Anivia's passive swing in, deal 1 or 2 damage ability. So it's very, very difficult for the barrier deck to actually keep its units alive against us, whether it be in combat or not. So they're kind of damned either way. On the flip side of that, if you're looking at playing against more control decks, like the War Mother control deck that we talked about before, this deck is really effective against that, because you have incredibly sticky creatures in the form of your Anivias, right? So if they're trying to use their hard removal on you, probably they're only going to have enough to maybe kill the first half of Anivia, not the second, especially if you play around their mana such that you guarantee you have 2 Anivias. Absolute best case for them, they kill 1 Anivia twice and you still have 1 Anivia and you can start making some more. In addition to that, we have a lot of hard removal spells like your Vengeances, which are very good if they start playing, She Who Wanders or any other big minions. This kills a unit, not just a follower, so you can use it on something like a Tryndamere. We've also got Possession, which allows us to steal something like She Who Wanders, and then after we do that, we can actually resurrect it for ourselves, or we could kill it to gain life or draw cards. So we have a lot of different ways of basically grinding out control opponents. Better they can grind us out. And on top of that, because you're making a bunch of copies of Anivia on the board, it's super likely that any Anivia you draw will turn into her special card, the one that frostbites 2 different enemies. Because of that, it's very hard for anyone to actually play us to fatigue, because we essentially are guaranteed to constantly be able to shuffle cards back into our deck. So even in the most long-term matches against other control decks, we still kind of have an edge in some respects. Whereas in many cases, we can remove their champions, and eventually they're going to run out of shuffle effects back into their deck. There's a couple of other things that are kind of in here as hosers against control. Commander Ledros is one of the best examples. If you, for example, end up going Anivia without using your Islanders on it, you can use a bunch of Islanders on Ledros, and then just start every single turn at the end of the game halving their life until eventually they're so low that something like an avalanche kills them, which, probably keep in mind you're not going to have used that avalanche against their board early because they're control, right? So in that instance is actually a good finish card. Really this deck just kind of has so many angles of attack and is very difficult to punish, because if you're trying to go aggressive against the deck, yeah, sure, Anivia can't block, but realistically, do we care when we have all of these control spells? But if you're playing against control, well, yeah, sure, we don't have a ton of huge bombs. We're not playing Tryndamirs or anything like that, but we do have infinite damage in the form of Ledros, as well as the fact that we have a bunch of spells that can take out all their big creatures. So I'd say, of all the decks that I played against, none of them really felt that difficult to beat with this deck. Probably something like the hyper-aggressive decks that run Jinx is maybe the hardest thing, because if you just don't get your stuff when you need to, eventually they can sort of burn you out. But outside of burn decks, yeah, this really hasn't been something that I've struggled with winning with at all. And even still, I think this deck could be refined further. Like, I think, for example, probably having the Harrowing, Winter's Breath, She Who Wanders, and Ledros is maybe even more than we need against the decks where we need those kinds of things. And so we could probably run more of other stuff that lets us, for example, maybe one more Grasp of the Undying, which kind of helps us against more of the aggressive decks. I don't know. I really do think that this deck is going to be one of the strongest upon the game's release, because it just covers all of its bases. I guess, real quick before I hop into the one game that I have, unfortunately my recordings kind of broke when I was trying to get some footage of this, so I've only got one game that recorded fully from start to finish. It wasn't the best game either, but you do get to see a bit of what we were talking about. The one thing that I haven't talked about, though, which I'll mention briefly before we do that, is Ash. Now, original versions of this deck actually played one Tryndamere to Ash, and then I had it in treats at one point in the deck. I ended up, backing down to just 2 Ashes, because I think it is actually pretty good against some of the more mid-rangey decks. Plus, you have a lot of ways to get Frostbite, because, again, you're mostly going to have Anivia's spell card in hand later. So it does kind of make sense. In all honesty, I could see perhaps a version of this with just Anivia and replacing these 2 Ashes for Entreats being better and more consistent, but I only had that idea after the servers shut down. So when the servers come back up this coming week, I plan on giving that a shot. So in any case, I've only got one game to go through, but let's take a look at Zombie Bird Control. Okay, so this is a game that I played very late at night on the last day of the servers being up. I'm not entirely sure, if the list that I was going against was a particularly strong one. It certainly didn't feel that way in this game. But, you do get to see in this game, it wouldn't matter anyway because it's the only game that I was able to record, but you do get to see a bit of the combinations of cards that I was talking about. It's just extremely difficult to deal with the recursion that you have here. So one thing worth noting, and you'll actually see it here, I draw this Sentry and decide not to play it. There's a good reason for that. The hand that I have drawn is not especially fast, and as a result of that, saving that spell mana to use something like a Catalyst to ramp me into my later game things does make a lot more sense, especially because this version of the deck that I was playing at the time had the Tryndamere that you can see here, but also had things like a Treat, and it was just kind of a slower, dirtier version of the deck. So I wait to play the Sentry until I'm actually in a position where I have all of the spell mana that I would need. By waiting and generating all of that spell mana, I can do both it and Catalyst this turn, and you'll notice I don't block here to get full value out of that Catalyst. Might as well use the Sentry to block on a later turn. You never know if he's going to have pump spells or something like that anyway. So, and also I don't particularly need more cards right now. I'm not in a situation where I need stuff very urgently. So the draws that I've had haven't been particularly good this game. Like, I've drawn a lot of late game stuff against someone who's clearly trying to be kind of a mid-rangey deck, so that late game stuff isn't that useful. But by saving a bunch of spell mana here, as you're about to see, we are able to go for the Anivia and the Mirror Entity even this next turn if we decide that we want to. So we could begin our attack on the next turn with with 2 evolved Anivias, especially assuming that we wait until after his combat so the challenger can't mess us up, and we wait and make sure that he doesn't that he spends a lot of his mana and can't have removal, right? So that's kind of the best case thing to happen here. We do go for the draw first, because why not? But considering how heavy our hand is, like, in hindsight, I'm not sure whether or not, like, trying to ramp here was better than just playing Anivia and Splinter Soul. If we wanted to play it the most safely and still play the Anivia Splinter Soul combo, we would have admittedly had to wait and perhaps risk him not playing anything and passing back to us and we lose all that mana. So I'd like being proactive one way or the other. Given the color combinations that he was, I think it's pretty unlikely that he would have, with 6 mana, been able to kill Anivia twice, but you never know. So I decided to play it passive. He has a small window to respond here and try and make something happen, but at this point, especially with him being on the defense and being unable to use Challenger against us, it's difficult for him to interrupt what we're beginning to set up. So basically anything that he plays there results in us going for the Splinter Soul immediately so that we get them on the board and make it so that we can have multiple Anivias. Something that you have to be careful with this combo is that because this is a slow spell, it can be fizzled if someone tries to kill you in the middle of that, which is why, in the ideal scenario, you wait for them to spend mana first. You just can't always force that situation, however. So here, with these 2 Anivias and the Sentry, we go for the swing in. We're going to do 2 to his entire board, so it'll just kill the Laurent Challenger because of the tough, I think is the name of the keyword on the one guy. It won't actually kill that. But he honestly should perhaps not even block the Anivia on the far left. It doesn't really help him because basically it just is a free trade for me. As with the triggers, that 6 health guy is going to die to Anivia, and then my Anivia comes back anyway. And an important thing to note, which I thought was really interesting when I was first playing this deck, if, let's say, he didn't block the far Anivia, and the middle Anivia died and then resurrected and evolved next turn, that would actually evolve, or level up, rather, the Anivia that was already alive. Like, it doesn't need to die to flip if any of them flip. So here, again, small window of time for him to do something. If he had an avalanche, that'd be kind of a blowout. But keep in mind that we ramped earlier to protect against that because we do have She Who Wanders and Trendemir and that kind of stuff in hand. But yeah, 2 evolved Anivias now, and it's not our turn to attack, but pretty soon it will be, and as you can imagine, it's going to be a lot of pressure on him when we do. Plus, with She Who Wanders, we can probably clear the way pretty easily. It looks like that's, in fact, the direction that we take on this turn. In hindsight, I think probably, holding on to that She Who Wanders made more sense, perhaps even just passing there, because if he attacks, oh no, we take 8 damage when we're on 20, he's not going to finish us up there, especially because the spell that he added to his hand is a slow spell. But on top of that, had we played at the beginning of next turn, perhaps we could have drawn some more stuff out of him, or even just later on this turn. But as it now stands, as soon as he passes back to us, we swing, and he's probably taking lethal. Maybe he has 1 blocker and lives 1 turn, but at this point the game is kind of a foregone conclusion, outside of some crazy stuff, and he surrenders right there. All right, well, that will do it for Zombie Bird Control. I'm sorry I didn't have more gameplay to show you guys, but once the beta phase comes back, I'll definitely be tuning this deck and working on it more. I think it's a pretty exciting deck, and I really do think these Resurrection cards are pretty broken. The next deck that I'm going to talk about on the channel is actually, I call it Light and Shadow. It is a Lucian Senna combo deck that works alongside the Shadow Isles cards in order to basically do a lot of killing your own things and resurrecting your own things, such that Lucian and Senna can trigger each other, and it can create ephemeral units that die in the middle of combat to really surprise your opponents, because when they do, it adds to the stacks on the Lucian, for example. It's a really, really interesting deck, I think, and I actually have a lot more gameplay of that one, so keep your eyes peeled for that video. But until next time, thanks for checking this one out, and I'll see you next time.